Hey there, it's Christian from Severn Gaming Network, and I'm here with the Star Wars Destiny video, and this is a continuation of the series that I started where we looked at the different archetypes and how they do their matchups and how we can adjust our tactics according to what matchup we find ourselves in. Now, the first video that I did was Aggro archetype versus all the other types, and I also did a bit of an intro to the whole series on there. So let's dive straight into today's archetype, which is control decks. Now, control decks are, well, they're actually the opposite end of the spectrum to the aggro decks that we covered in the first video. So the things that we can expect to see in our control decks, here are some features of them. They generally have access to a good amount of manipulation, dice manipulation and dice removal. And that's whether that's through individual cards that we can play out, or whether that's through the dice that we could have in play. So whether that's dice removal like he doesn't like you, or whether that's using our dice control with specials like force throw. They also tend to have quite a bit of access to disrupt, where we get rid of opponent's resources, and discard, where we get rid of cards from an opponent's hand. They can also have an element of control, a slightly less direct element of control, which is sort of milling, so actually removing cards directly from your deck into your discard pile. So classic examples of a control type character would include characters like Jabba. I mean, Jabba the Hutt is he's a pure control character. He doesn't deal any damage. He allows you to re-roll dice. The re-roll yellow dice, that would be a classic control element, trying to re-roll things. He's got 2 sides of focus, 2 disrupt, 2 discard. He really is all about the control and getting you some resources. Often the control decks will have some focus in, because they will also want further ways of making sure that they get the things that they want. That's the idea of control. They're going to have control over what they can produce, what they can make, what results they get themselves to. What's definitive about discard decks is that they're slower, and that's no different in Destiny as to any other CCG. The rule is, as the game goes longer, control decks and their ability to win, or their likelihood of winning, really increases. So they tend to be more vulnerable in the early game. So, for instance, against aggro, as we looked at in the last video, you'll see that if an aggro can push hard early against a control deck, well, then they're more likely to win. Now, a big feature of control decks is that there is usually more decisions to make. There are a number of ways in which you can control the game. Destiny has, there's resources you can control. There's cards that you can control in an opponent's hand. There's dice on the table that you can control. There are your own dice that you can control. There are so many ways in which you can affect and influence the outcome of a game. And that creates a huge number of decisions to be able to make. And that's where control decks traditionally can be a little more difficult to play, because their power comes from being able to make the right choice at the right time with all the options at your disposal. And if you've only got 2 choices, that's much easier to make the right one or the best one than if you've got 4 or 5. And that's often where control decks can be a little overwhelming at first when if you're learning any collectible card game. Destiny's no different. And so they can be a little more difficult to play. And generally they win through, well, one of several ways. In Destiny we can win through the mill, and that's a lot more realistic than in many CCGs. They can also win through a sort of a slow choking of opponents' characters. So they do win by dealing out damage, but it's bits here, steady, 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 stopping any damage being dealt to them, and just being able to deal out a nice steady trickle of damage. Or they can sort of set up for just a massive alpha strike at the end. They get all their things in play that they want, and then they have a very powerful character who can dish out lots of damage. Is another typical way that we see control builds happening at the moment. So let's dig into these specific matchups then. Control versus aggro. You've got two priorities when you're playing as control versus aggro. The first one is to survive. You just need to stay alive. They're most dangerous early game when you don't have much in play. You might not have many force throws or force chokes in play, or whatever it is that's defining how you're going to control the game. That might not really come around until mid to late game, certainly by late game, and you need them getting there by the mid game. Because against aggro, they're going to be trying to push fast, put lots of pressure on you. So survive. Use your dice cut, your manipulation, your removal to mitigate as much damage as you can, and make sure that you survive. And what you also have to be doing though at the same time, it's not enough to just stop damage. You also have to be building your own board state, because you have to get to that point where you are under control, where you're in control. Now in other CCGs, aggro decks can fizzle out. It's not really the case in Destiny, because most of how an aggro deck builds its power is through permanence. You know, you're playing out F11D rifles, you're playing out the blasters and the jetpacks and so on. Well, they stay there. Every turn they're going to get to use them again. So if you aren't dealing any damage as a control deck, which is important, I believe every deck needs to be able to deal damage to pressure your opponent, then what's going to happen is you might stay alive for 3 rounds, brilliant, but by the 4th round, you know, they've got maybe 2 characters, you know, they might have a total of 5 or 6 upgrades in play. You can't deal when they start chucking great big batches of dice if you haven't built up your own board state as well. So against aggro, it's not just about surviving, it's also this balance of surviving and maybe early game taking some resources from your character dice so that you can also not only be paying for your flanks and those kind of mitigating type cards, but that you can also pay for the upgrades that you need. It really is it's a game of balancing resources, and they're difficult. You know, these decisions you're going to make. Do you disrupt for 2, or go for resources to keep on building? Because potentially, if you disrupt them for 2, well, actually, you may well be able to just stay alive that bit longer anyway to get more resources next turn. This is where the complexity of playing control decks really comes to the fore. And I think knowing the problem that the deck is trying to set you is fundamental to control and whether you win out or not. And I'm going to come on to that more, even more so, because that's more of a feature in control versus control. Okay, so these are the important aspects then, the sort of summary, if you like. You need to survive against aggro, and you need to make sure that you're still building up yourself as well. So it's survive and build. Now then, control versus control. Now, this to me feels a little bit like, you know, when you see, you know, like Dooku and Yoda, and, you know, Dooku's throwing a force lightning, Yoda's sort of absorbing it, but there's just this 2 big, powerful forces coming at each other, and they're almost cancelling each other out. I know you could say Yoda's just absorbing it, but whatever. You get the point. Control feels like these 2 big, powerful forces just vying for an edge, just vying for the upper hand. And I think that's generally how these games feel when they play out. They can start very cagey in control versus control. You know, a little bit of disrupt here. Well, I'll discard a card back. Well, I'll discard some of your cards. Well, I'll disrupt some of your resources. I'll play an upgrade. Oh, I'll play an upgrade. You know, there's not normally swing for 6 damage, because that's more aggro style. So you have these control decks which are both trying to play longer to build their board state, and they're not really needing to do the whole surviving against each other, because neither of them's really looking to dish out damage straight from the off. So you get this building sort of sense, and then there will come a point where there becomes, and you can subtly sense it, or sometimes it can be very obvious, when one person shifts into being the aggressor. So the one deck starts to get something in play that can start bringing the damage, or one player gets something off, okay, you know, like a big move, a big event or something like that, that just switches and one player realizes, oh, I've just suddenly lost this, I've lost the upper hand. The other player has now the upper hand. Some people might refer to that as tempo. They've got slightly more tempo. That's really more of an aggro phrase, I would say. In this, it's just that got the upper hand with the control. The other player is now more dictating the play. And of course, as a control deck, that's what we want to be doing, dictating the play as much as we can. So, knowing the meta, knowing what decks are out there, knowing what control decks are out there, and knowing how those control decks are looking to control things is really important, because that's what's going to allow you then to anticipate this moment and play with it in mind, play towards it, know that it's coming. It's in a sense, know your answers to those problems, as I mentioned earlier on, that the control deck is going to try and set you. What is your answer? Because what your answer is to this particular problem that the control deck sets, so that it can become the aggressor, it can get the upper hand, that's going to dictate your mulligan. You know, in this, oh, I'm playing against Jabba Vader, I need these cards. I'm playing against a particular Padme Mill deck, I need these cards. It's going to dictate what you discard to re-roll. It's going to dictate the upgrades that you play, if you play them at all, and when. So it impacts a lot. Okay, for example, if you're playing, say you were playing against like a Padme Mill deck, and they've got some blue in there. So what you see when you look on the board and you see lots of cheap upgrades in play, is you're going to think, uh-oh, patience. You know, if they're able to put out 6, 7, 8 dice in a turn, if they can patience me, that's a really big issue. That's going to really put the game in their favour if they can chuck out 8 cards from my deck, whatever. So your answers then will disrupt. They need a resource to be able to play patience. So if you can keep on top of them and keep disrupting their resources after they've rolled a few dice out, that's a brilliant way to control them and stop that play from happening. You could do mass removal. So maybe you're thinking of things like force misdirection, or those kind of bigger ways of removing more, block and dodge. These big removal cards, or you just need to go faster. You know, maybe you can't stop the patience going off, but actually you could just, I've got Kylo's lightsaber in hand, I can load Vader up and just go here and I need to just pressure for the kill, and then it's become a race. But you can see how there's that subtle shift when a card like Patience is played and a lot of cards suddenly go out of your deck, that your opponent in that control matchup has made that big first step towards gaining the upper hand. So, in summary, control versus control, you need to know the meta. I think that will really help you. Know the problems that various control decks are going to set you, and then know your own solutions. And then it becomes very fluid. You need to adjust your tactics accordingly. And that's where that skillful element of the game comes into play. Control versus mid-range, I think this is much easier when you're playing as control than if you're playing against fast aggro or playing against another control deck. And that's because a mid-range deck by its very nature is bringing middling damage, where you've probably got quite a lot of card manipulation and dice mitigation in the damage mitigation in there. So you can probably weather the storm, because it's not going to be a storm. It's just going to be a light bit of drizzle, or maybe a bit of a rain shower now and again. It's not going to be just wave after wave after wave of big damage coming. Not only that, but they also, because they're a mid-range deck, they have sort of middling control elements as well. So therefore, if you're a pure control deck, you should win out in that. Now, of course, the balance is the fact that they are probably able to put out a bit more damage than you early game, and that means that you've got to use up more resources to mitigate and manipulate. But they're also going to be getting their control pieces going as well, and that might give them just enough to counteract the damage that you might be able to try and put out with your Knight Sisters at the end of the round or something like that. So that's not to say this matchup is it's easy. You know, oh, control versus mid-range, that's always going to win. It just means that certainly on paper, that theoretically you should be able to deal with the damage that they're chucking out and build your board state, because they're not going to be chucking out all that much damage, and with both of you trying to build your board state, you should build a better board state, be in control. So generally stall them out. You will establish control, and then just ride out what damage they can do to you early on, and get that control in place. Okay, so finally then, control versus combo. The combo, to me, this is the easiest matchup. Combo just wants to get a set of cards and dice, you know, or a particular combo in play. And for that, they usually need resources. Often lots of them, certainly if we're playing the most widely used combo deck at the moment is Hyperloop. And that needs lots of resources. It's got to get 5 resources to be able to play at Millennium Falcon. So if you disrupt them, you are straight away controlling their ability to put together this combo. Not only that, but they often need cards in hand. You know, they need to get hold of a Falcon. Well, if you're discarding them, then you're much more likely to discard that. And they have to use up resources, or they hopefully have their graveyards, they can get support cards out. You can see where I'm saying that if you're able to just disrupt and discard, often that is enough to just control that combo deck and stop it from being able to do its combo. And if they do get the dice into play, you know, they do get Falcon in, well then you've got removal and you've got manipulation to be able to deal with it. So know the combos, know the combo decks out there. Hyperloop's in your real one in the Awakening set, but I'm sure there'll be others. And so know what to save your cards and your dice for. Okay, as an example, against Hyperloop, how we're going to play when we're control is we'll disrupt their resources first and foremost. Secondly, discard the cards so that you hit Falcon. And thirdly, if it does get in, well then, you know, use your deflect, your flanks, you know, all those kind of cards that are just going to mitigate that dice or remove it and take it out of the game. Okay, so there's just some general ideas really for you when you are playing as control and playing against all these other archetypes. But control is a very difficult, I think, deck type to play, archetype to play with. Personally, it's my favourite, it's the most satisfying, and it really does feel very, very powerful when you have control of the board and your opponent feels like, oh, this is horrible, I can't do anything here. Okay, I love that that feeling and that sensation. So this is definitely my favourite type to play, but it's really hard. And you need to know your deck, and you need to know the meta and the decks that are out there. So as ever, if you want to get in touch with me, then please leave a message on the comments, or if you want to get in touch with me through the Knights of Ren Discord channel, my name's Peace Lord on there. And if you haven't listened to the Knights of Ren podcast yet, totally check it out. Those guys really know what they're talking about. They're seriously good, competitive players. And if you want to improve your competitive play, then that is an absolute mine of information in their podcasts. I'd also like to say a really big thank you. I have had such a wonderful and amazingly sort of positive, encouraging response to all the videos that I've done, and I'd really like to thank every one of you who has contacted me to say that you've enjoyed the content. And especially on this series of videos, the response on the Aggro archetype matchup video was really positive, and so I'm thoroughly looking forward to getting this series finished for you all to enjoy. So with that said, until the next video, keep enjoying Destiny.